Thank you very much, Lucy. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone. And yeah, thank you for the invitation and thank you to Lucy for all the organization. I'm just going to share my screen to begin with. And we tested this and it worked. So hopefully this will work now for everybody. Can you see my slide?
Yep, looks good.
Good. Okay, I'll just check it's going to move forward. Perfect. Great. So thank you all very much for joining us today for this webinar. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share the headline messages from the IPBES assessment report on invasive alien species and their control. It's been a long time where I've had to be very quiet about our findings and the work that we've been doing. And so now for me, it's just an absolute privilege to be able to share the excitement of this assessment with you all, and also an opportunity to say thank you to everyone who's been involved, and thank you very much to DEFRA for nominating me in the first place for this assessment, and to everyone who perhaps has provided comments through the review process over the 4 years, or maybe you've been a contributing author, or maybe you've just shown interest to me at a meeting, or because you're here today, you're showing an interest as well. So thank you all very, very much. So I thought I'd just begin with a little bit of information about the overall process. So this IPBES assessment has been developed over 4 years. We've had 3 author meetings. We had our first in Japan in person, which was really, really exciting. And I'm so delighted that we had that opportunity to actually meet in person with the whole authorship team before, of course, we had the COVID pandemic and we had to move things online. And indeed, COVID has been a sort of influence throughout this assessment, shall I say, and actually I have COVID at the moment, so it continues to be an influence on this assessment. But we were able to move the meetings online, and then we had our final meeting in Denmark, which was a hybrid meeting. We've had a couple of external review processes, and it's been really fantastic to have thousands and thousands of comments because it provided really useful insights and guided us in developing the assessment further. And just before we went to the IPBES Plenary 10, we had a final review by governments, and again had some really amazing and useful insights and contributions as a consequence of that. So it's been produced by a multidisciplinary team of 86 experts and 199 contributing authors. We have reviewed many, many documents in depth, so about 13,000 we've actually reviewed in depth. But then if you look across the assessment, you'll see we did a number of, I wouldn't want to call them mini reviews because they were huge, but for example, we did a review on scenarios and models where we screened 33,000 references. So it's a huge amount of information that goes into these assessments, but also across different values and knowledge systems as well. So drawing not only on the scientific peer-reviewed literature, but also grey literature, and very importantly, information from Indigenous and local knowledge. So we had 3 dialogue workshops with Indigenous peoples and local communities. Again, we had one in person, but then switched to being online after that. We also had a very specific call for contributions from Indigenous peoples and local communities to provide further information and insights to include within the assessment. And throughout the assessment, we also collaborated with Indigenous and local knowledge holders and experts, and some within the expert team and others as contributing authors as well. So this shows a picture where we did all manage to meet in person in Japan, and our experts span 47 countries, encompassing all of the UN regions and many, many different disciplines. And alongside our contributing authors as well, we really did have a fantastic team contributing to this assessment. And we were supported by an IPBES technical support unit who are based in the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan. And I have to say they were absolutely outstanding and really provided us not only with guidance on the process, but also incredible expertise as well. So I'd just like to show you the expert team and all of the names of the people, and I can look across all of those names and think of very happy memories of all of them, and their engagement with the process and their dedication and commitment has just been absolutely amazing, a really fantastic team. So now getting onto the actual substance of the report, I thought it might be useful, first of all, to define what are invasive alien species. And actually, we've had long discussions over this because there are a number of definitions available. And we had one very specific definition within the scoping documents. Every IPBES assessment has an initial scoping document produced. And that really provides the authors and the expert team with guidance in terms of which kind of particular questions the people involved in that scoping document would like to see answered, and also some of the key definitions and terminology. So we followed that very closely. We also had the benefit of a number of assessments that had gone on, of course, before this thematic assessment. And the global assessment back in 2019, the IPBES Global Assessment, highlighted that invasive alien species are one of the 5 major drivers of biodiversity loss. So alien species are animals, plants, and other organisms that have been introduced from one part of the world to another part of the world by human activities. And this human activities is a really important part of this definition. So these are species that have been moved from their so-called natural range to a new region by human activities. A subset of these alien species are termed invasive alien species. And we're using the term invasive alien species for those species which have established, spread, and have some negative impact on nature, and also noting that many of these invasive alien species also have impacts on people. And of course, this is an incredibly diverse group of animals, plants, and other organisms. So another important term to introduce at this stage is biological invasions and the biological invasion process. And this is one of the infographics that we have within the summary of policymakers of the IPBES assessment. And I'm really grateful to Tom August and Kate Randall and the IPBES team for producing such beautiful infographics. And we hope that this really does provide a sort of glossary, a mini glossary of some of the key terms for the assessment. And on the left-hand side, it shows the biological invasion process and then some of the key terms around species status and some of the mechanisms on the right-hand side. So biological invasion specifically is the process involving the intentional or unintentional transport or movement of the species from its natural range by human activities and its introduction to new regions where it may become established and spread. So I will go straight to some of the key findings from the assessment. So one of our key findings are that invasive alien species are indeed a major threat to people and nature and in all regions of Earth. So with all of the information that we gathered, we have a database of about 37,000 established alien species that have been introduced by human activities. We're seeing an increase in terms of 200 new alien species every year. Of this subset of this 37,000, which are termed invasive alien species, these ones with negative impacts on nature and also in some cases on people, there's about 3,500. And we can look at the breakdown of that in a little bit more detail, and we can see that 1,061 of these species are alien plants, and then we have about 1,852 alien invertebrates and 461 alien vertebrates and 141 alien microbes, which are known to be invasive globally. So indeed, invasive alien species are a global threat, and we have impacts. In chapter 4 of this assessment, we collated in a very structured and systematic way documented impacts, and we looked both at negative and positive impacts from alien species. And we can see that of all of the impacts that are reported, we have a dominance of them from the Americas, about 34%, Europe and Central Asia close behind with 31%, and Asia Pacific 25%, but notably perhaps far fewer reported in Africa with only 7%. And it's really important to remember, of course, despite our very best efforts to gather all this information, there will be gaps in the information. And for sure, our access to information around impacts on Africa, we really feel that there needs to be a greater flow of information to properly represent the actual impacts. I think it's also important to note that even the areas that are protected for nature or those that are considered remote are vulnerable to the negative impacts of biological invasions. We were also able to break down these negative impacts in terms of the different environments where they are reported from. And there's a huge dominance. 75% negative impacts have been reported from the terrestrial realm. And we particularly have a lot of information on the negative impacts within temperate and boreal forests and woodlands and cultivated areas, and a lot less from the freshwater and the marine realms. So we're very acutely aware of the major threat of invasive alien species and indeed the dramatic and in some cases irreversible changes to nature across all regions of Earth. And again, for a few more headline statistics, and I hope that I'm not overwhelming you with some of the headline facts and figures from the assessment, but I'll go ahead anyway. The 60% of global extinctions have been caused solely or alongside other drivers by invasive alien species. And actually 16% of global extinctions are caused solely by invasive alien species. And a very high number of documented local extinctions as well, with 1,215 documented local extinctions of native species caused by invasive alien species. I mentioned that we gathered information on both the negative and positive impacts of invasive alien species, and there really is a dominance in terms of the negative impacts, with 85% documented impacts on nature being negative. And I think another important key finding is that the impacts of invasive alien species are extremely varied. And this is another infographic from our summary for policymakers, and we can see that invasive alien species have impacts on nature, but they might also have impacts on good quality of life and nature's contributions to people. And here in this infographic, we just try to pull out a few different species to show that there are some species that will have impacts across all of these different categories: nature, good quality of life, and nature's contributions to people. For example, the red imported fire ant and water hyacinth being very, very good examples of that. So in terms of the mechanisms of impacts on nature, the ways in which these invasive alien species are causing these impacts, they're very varied as well. And again, we were able to quantify this from this amazing database that was constructed through Chapter 4. And we can see that a high proportion, 27%, change ecosystems, but 18% are causing impacts through predation, a further 12% through herbivory, and 24% competing with native species. However, we know that there are many other mechanisms, and we have also documented those. We just have lower reports in those kind of categories around hybridization, disease, physical disturbance, and structural disturbance, and impacts through interactions with other species. It was really important for us to pull out the information on islands. So we know that islands are particularly vulnerable to environmental change, and it's no exception for invasive alien species. Indeed, they are a major driver of biodiversity loss on islands. So 20% of all the impacts that we documented were reported from islands. 90% of those global extinctions that I mentioned with invasive alien species, one of the major causes, also on islands. And indeed, on about a quarter of islands, the number of alien plants exceeds the total number of native plants. And I think what's also very worrying is that islands are vulnerable to climate change, and we know that the interactions amongst these different so-called drivers of biodiversity change are amplifying the effects of the other drivers. So we know that climate change is having really profound effects on invasive alien species. Through our many studies, and particularly those where we were able to extract the information from Indigenous and local knowledge, we're able to see that people with the greatest direct dependence on nature, including Indigenous peoples, local communities, may be disproportionately affected by invasive alien species. And there isn't a huge amount of evidence that we're able to draw on gender and age differentiated impacts, but those that we were able to draw on demonstrated that there was marginalization and inequities as a consequence of invasive alien species, and particularly in these contexts. We were also able to document that there's 2,300 invasive alien species on the lands of Indigenous peoples across all regions of Earth. And I had the great privilege of attending one of the workshops with Indigenous peoples and local communities, and the insights from those workshops and from the reviews that we carried out provided incredible information for this assessment. And we were able to highlight the way in which invasive alien species negatively affect the autonomy rights and cultural identities of Indigenous peoples and local communities through the loss of traditional livelihoods and knowledge, reducing mobility and access to land, and increased labour to manage invasive alien species. So moving from nature to think about how do invasive alien species impact people, there's many, many different ways in which invasive alien species are impacting people through economies, food security, water security, human health, and cultural identities, which are all negatively affected by invasive alien species. And indeed, when we look at all of the documented impacts in relation to nature's contributions to people, which is analogous to ecosystem services, 80% of the impacts are documented as negative, and food supply being by far the most frequently reported category of impacts. We also have this estimate of the global annual cost of 423 billion US dollars. And I think it's really important, though, to say that that figure is just the tip of an iceberg. It comes from an amazing project called InfoCost, where they've collated lots and lots of information on the annual cost of biological invasions globally, which is a huge, huge undertaking. And they're very transparent about the caveats and constraints around that database. And they know that there's lots of missing information. It's really hard to quantify some impacts in terms of their economic costs. Some of these things are really quite intangible. So as I mentioned before, if people are having to spend more time weeding or managing pests on their lands, it's very hard actually to quantify those kinds of costs. So for sure, this 423 billion US dollars is really only the tip of the iceberg. And I think a really important aspect around, though, this cost and this figure that we have got is that 92% of these costs accrue from the negative impact of invasive alien species on nature's contributions to people and good quality of life directly, and only 8% is related actually to the management expenditures of biological invasions. So there's obviously these very, very direct economic costs of invasive alien species. This is another of the infographics that we have within the summary for policymakers. And here in the center, we're giving some examples from around the world of different invasive alien species and the kind of impacts that they have, summarizing the extinction, the information on the extinctions, and particularly the breakdown of the local extinctions in the bottom left-hand corner, and also showing the economic costs, and perhaps importantly here, highlighting how it has been quadrupling every decade. And then also to highlight the impacts on good quality of life as well in that sort of final orange column, if you like. And I think one of the important points to make here as well, and the reason why we separated out those bar charts in that bottom right-hand corner with the positive impacts at the top and the negative impacts at the bottom, is these aren't sort of summative things in any way at all. One positive impact plus a negative impact doesn't come up with some kind of sum. I think it's really important that we consider these different impacts separately, but really noting the dominance of negative impacts. So other headline messages from the reports as we move towards thinking about policies, it's really evident that current policies have been insufficient in managing biological invasions and preventing and controlling invasive alien species. So many countries have targets for the management of biological invasions within national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Indeed, from our synthesis of the evidence, is about 80% of countries. But 83% of countries do not have national legislation or regulations that are directed specifically towards prevention and control of invasive alien species. And about 45% of countries do not invest in the management of invasive alien species. So against this backdrop, of the policy and management commitments, it's perhaps very concerning to see that the threats from invasive alien species are increasing significantly in every region of the world across all taxa. So this panel of graphs shows different taxonomic groups, mammals, birds, etc., and each line is a different UN region, and showing the trend in alien species records over time. And the important thing is just to note, in all cases, there's a dramatic increase. So 37% of all known alien species have been reported since 1970. And the number of alien species has been rising continuously for centuries in all regions. And indeed, we expect it to continue increasing into the future. So we, people, are very much at the heart of the problem. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's all about the human activities that's core to this definition, facilitating the transport, the introduction, the establishment, and the spread of invasive alien species. And if things remain unchanged, if it's business as usual scenarios, then by 2050, we're predicting the total number of alien species globally to be about 36% higher than it was in 2005. But we know that we're not on trajectories for business as usual at the moment. We know that climate change is worsening, land and sea use change are worsening, and we know that these interact very strongly with invasive alien species. And so therefore we anticipate, if we carry on as things are at the moment, then the figure will be substantially higher than this. So when we think about those human activities, global trade and economic activities are particularly important in facilitating the transport and introduction of invasive alien species. There's a very strong link between the volume of commodity imports and the number of invasive species in a region, and patterns in the global spread of species that mirror shipping and air traffic networks, for instance. And it has been the case that biosecurity measures at borders have not kept pace with this growing volume, the diversity and the origins of global trade and travel, and that the projected growth in international trade and movement of people, including tourism, is going to lead to further pressure on these border inspection regimes. So I've already mentioned around land and sea use change and climate change facilitating the establishment and spread of invasive alien species. And there's a number of ways in which this can happen. So for example, land and sea use changes may increase the vulnerability of natural ecosystems and alter processes that cause natural disturbance of landscapes, which make them more vulnerable to the establishment of invasive alien species. We also see from the evidence we synthesized the ways in which transportation and utility infrastructures can create corridors. So these can be canals or roads or rail networks that facilitate the spread of invasive alien species. And indeed, marine and aquatic infrastructure also alters seascapes and the functioning of marine ecosystems. And we have evidence within the report of the ways in which the artificial infrastructure, such as pontoons, etc., actually are more favourable for establishment of invasive alien species than more natural surfaces, and also facilitate the spread of invasive alien species. So we know that climate change, along with the continued intensification and expansion of land use and sea use change, is going to lead to increases in the establishment and spread of invasive alien species. So this is another of the infographics from our assessment, and essentially we have listed the indirect, the direct, and other drivers down the left-hand side, and then these little dials are showing across different stages of the biological invasion process the relative importance of those different drivers at that stage of the invasion process. And this is a figure that was developed for all biomes, so terrestrial and aquatic, and shows the relative importance of these different drivers facilitating biological invasions. So we can see that land and sea use change and climate change are particularly important through establishment and spread, whereas these economic drivers are very important in the transport and introduction of invasive alien species. And I've already mentioned that this ongoing amplification of drivers of change in nature, such as climate change and land and sea use change, will increase the number of invasive alien species and their impacts in the future, and the ways in which these can amplify the threats. And these can be very, very complex and provide a whole variety of different cascades and feedbacks that can make predictions very, very difficult. But despite the difficulty, I think it's really clear that with everything continuing to be as it is and worsening, then there are going to be future increases in the risk of invasive alien species as a consequence. And as I've already mentioned, it's extremely difficult to make some of these predictions because of these complex interactions. But we include a picture of a fire here because I think it's all too evident from the pictures that we have seen through the summer months, for instance, the devastating fires in Hawaii, the ways in which they were driven with the fuel of alien plants and the interactions with climate change to really, really cause that dreadful situation. And we anticipate climate change interacting with land and seas change will profoundly shape and amplify the future threat from invasive alien species. But there's a variety of other factors that will influence and interact with other drivers as well. And there's huge variations in human perceptions and values around invasive alien species. And perhaps interestingly, this adds another level of complexity. So I feel like I've presented a very stark picture for you all during your lunchtime. And indeed, the messages are stark. We have a major and growing threat of invasive alien species. And I think what was really important to all of us, though, throughout this assessment process was that we considered the solutions. So if you've had an opportunity to look at the summary for policymakers, you'll see that Section A and Section B are all about the problems, and Section C and D are all about the solutions. And biological invasions and their adverse impacts can be prevented and mitigated through effective management. So this really is a driver of change for which there are achievable and tangible actions that we can take to address this problem. And that would benefit other drivers of change as well. So through the report, we highlight a variety of different management options, but specifically management around pathways, management of target invasive alien species, and site-based and ecosystem-based management. And this is another of the infographics from the summary for policymakers. And I know that I'm taking quite a lot of time, so I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but essentially it's showing the invasion curve and where along that curve different management actions and management targets are applicable. And it just shows a difference between the terrestrial systems and the marine systems, in that in marine systems, prevention is absolutely critical, because once a species has established, it's very, very difficult to do something about it within marine systems, whereas there are more options within terrestrial systems, but nevertheless prevention remains the most effective and cost-effective option for dealing with invasive alien species and biological invasions in terrestrial and also aquatic systems. And prevention can be achieved through pathway management, strictly enforcing import controls, pre-border, border and post-border biosecurity, and measures to address escape from confinement. It's particularly important on islands, and it's absolutely critical in marine and connected water systems where attempts at eradicating and containing invasive alien species have mostly failed. And it's really important that we have sustained and adequate funding, capacity building, and technical and scientific innovations and transfer of technology for monitoring, good quarantine and inspection facilities to ensure that we can put in place these effective prevention measures. But although prevention and preparedness are the most cost-effective options in all systems, there are other options available as well, and eradication has been successful, especially for small and slow-spreading populations of invasive alien species in isolated ecosystems. But of course, there's some really great examples of success of eradication within the UK, and indeed these are included within the summary for policymakers. But containment control can also be an effective option, particularly in terrestrial systems and closed water systems, so lakes, for example, and ponds. But it is important to note in marine systems and those systems where the water systems are connected, measures beyond prevention are largely unsuccessful. I think it is really important, and we were at pains to make this point throughout the assessment and within the summary for policymakers, that it shouldn't just stop at the management point. It's really important to consider the recovery of ecosystem functions and include ecosystem restoration within the management options. And in order to make these prevention and other types of management happen, then engagement and collaboration with stakeholders and Indigenous peoples and local communities is really important, and indeed does improve management actions for biological invasions. And I mentioned earlier on that there can be very different and diverging perceptions around specific invasive alien species, and engagement and collaboration is really important to talk through these conflicting perceptions of the value of invasive alien species, and also to consider the ethics of management options. So this sharing collaboration across knowledge systems is absolutely critical. So I'm sure everyone is very familiar now with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed in December 2022, and Target 6 specifically is on invasive alien species, and at the core of that is about reducing the rates of introduction and establishment of other known or potential invasive alien species by at least 50% by 2030. And this target really does provide us all with an opportunity to develop and update aspirational, ambitious and realistic approaches to prevent and control invasive alien species. One of the aspects that we have taken in a lot of detail through the assessment is around integrated governments, and highlighting how ambitious progress in the management of biological invasions can be achieved with integrated governance. And we outline 7 strategic actions to prevent introduction and impact of invasive alien species. Some of these I have already mentioned around coordination and collaboration across international and regional mechanisms, developing and adopting effective and achievable national strategies, sharing efforts and commitment and understanding the specific role of all stakeholders, improving the coherence of policy, this broad engagement across stakeholders and Indigenous peoples and local communities, ensuring adequate resourcing for innovation, research and technology, and supporting information systems and infrastructures and data sharing. And across all of this, I would say that one of the aspects that came out really strongly through the negotiations at the IPBES Plenary 10 was the importance of capacity building, the importance of sharing expertise across borders through collaboration and commitment to other nations and supporting them in their efforts to halt the problems associated with invasive alien species. So it isn't just, of course, about the Kunming-Montreal Target 6. We also know that preventing and controlling invasive alien species will strengthen the effectiveness of policies designed to respond to other threats to biodiversity, and indeed contribute to achieving several sustainable development goals. And I won't go through all of those, but actually when we were looking through the Sustainable Development Goals, there are ways in which most of them could be contributed through the controlling of invasive alien species. So we're very hopeful that the evidence we present through the thematic assessment report on invasive alien species and their control, that this provides compelling evidence for immediate and sustained action. And we really hope that it is an assessment of optimism, that with sufficient resources, long-term commitment to preventing and controlling invasive alien species are really attainable goals, and that this would yield significant long-term benefits for people and nature. So I just will finish by talking about a few of the impacts that we're hoping for from the assessment. So this is the first comprehensive global report on invasive alien species and their control. As I outlined at the beginning, it draws on a huge body of evidence of information and really highlights that invasive alien species are a major and growing threat to biodiversity in the ecosystems, but also to people. And throughout, though, we have provided options for governments, civil society, Indigenous peoples, local communities, the private sector, and indeed anyone seeking to address the issue of biological invasions. We've had incredible impact already through the media, and this is just to show some of the reports that we have had. So after the assessment was approved on the Saturday at the beginning of September, we then spent several days in interviews with global media promoting the assessment, and it was really just very exciting and very rewarding to know that there was that interest in the assessment. And I just put a few highlights from the UK, but there was a lot within the UK press. But in total, globally, we had 2,787 media items associated with this assessment, spanning 50 languages and coverage in 123 countries. So we were really delighted, and actually that figure is going up, and we're still giving interviews and we're still providing information. And I'm delighted that there will be, I will be able to give a number of talks between now and the months to come to highlight the findings from this assessment and hopefully to answer questions from people that can make it as useful as possible for them. So we hope that this report is going to help in sharing of information within and across countries, and I already mentioned that importance around capacity building and sharing of information, particularly in developing countries. And it was exciting already to see the report from GBIF that they're going to be supporting increasing and enhancing information flow for tackling invasive alien species. As I've already mentioned, we hope that the findings of the assessment will be helpful in contributing to achieving international targets on biological invasions, and specifically Target 6 and the Sustainable Development Goals as well. And I really hope that it will be of value and of interest to you all. And I'm delighted to take any questions at this particular point, but I'm also very happy to take your questions by email going forward or through other opportunities to give talks. So thank you very much, and huge thanks to Lucy again for organising this webinar and inviting me to provide some of these headlines from the assessment.
Thank you, Helen, for a brilliant talk, and yeah, congratulations on a fantastic piece of work. I have seen there are a few questions already, so I will start going through these. If you do have questions, if you can put them in the chat box or the Q&A, and then we'll go through them. So the first one, firstly, an impressive body of work. A question in relation to the negative impacts dominating. To what extent is research biased towards looking for negative impacts as opposed to positive?
Yes, I think that there is some bias towards reporting negative impacts. However, we did find quite a number of documented positive impacts. And I think that though, regardless of the numbers and regardless of the figures, the important message is that invasive alien species do have these major and devastating impacts on nature and people. And some of them, of course, are also irreversible. I mean, the global extinctions, but also huge shifts and changes within landscapes and systems. So I think that there probably is a bias towards those impacts that are negative, but those negative impacts are absolutely overwhelming. And when we were actually going through looking at some of the benefits, it's actually really hard to tease apart, because some of the benefits that come out, particularly towards, for example, nature, might be to do with the invasive alien species causing the increase in abundance of another native species. And so we can think of that as a benefit to that other native species. But actually, when we think about it in a more complex kind of ecological network situation, the cascades of interactions and changes and the consequence of those shifts in community assemblages is something that I think we definitely need to grapple with a little more as well. So I think it's complex, but a great first question. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Some strong statistics and evidence. Can the slides be shared after the event, please? We'll be sharing the recording. We can share the slides as well if you like, Helen.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Yep.
And the summary for policymakers is, of course, already online, and
Yes.
the chapters will be available very, very soon. We're just doing the final changes and updates to the chapters to reflect changes through the negotiations at IPBES 10, but you'll have hundreds and hundreds of pages to be able to enjoy very soon.
We'll send around the summary for policymakers to everyone afterwards. Someone has asked if the INS database will be publicly accessible.
It certainly will be. So we have many, many data reports for this assessment, which provide that kind of metadata for how we went about various of the structured reviews throughout the different chapters. So all of those data reports are accessible to you, so you can see what data is available. The invasive non-native species database in terms of the records is already publicly available, and I can point you in the direction of those links. The impacts database is being held for 1 year while the authors from that chapter, because they just put in such an inordinate amount of work, are going to get some publications out for particular taxonomic groups. But you can see the report and what's in it. And of course, the summary is in the chapters with many, many detailed tables providing you with information breakdowns for different taxa, different habitats, a huge wealth of information within chapter 4. So that's the place to go to have a look.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got one which is a bit of a long one, so I might break it down into a few. Can you speak about the temporal dimension, so the distinction between native and invasive over time, and did you look at other ways of conceptualizing these species, so in line with the IPBES transformative change assessment and the need to think differently?
So I possibly don't fully understand the question. So you mean in terms of we looked at sort of temporal change over time?
So
That was
in the question, they've said, could
yes.
the species be considered victims of trafficking, for example? So invasive and alien are arguably negative terms,
Oh, yeah.
and this impacts management methods. So, for example, lower regard for animal welfare.
Okay, so yes, and within the assessment, we do include quite a lot of information, particularly in chapter 1, which is the introduction to the assessment, but also chapter 5 in terms of the management side, and chapter 6, which is to do with future policy options on various aspects to do with perceptions and values of invasive alien species, and also conflicting values as well, which I mentioned a little bit about in my talk, where, for example, a species may give benefits to one particular sector, but have disadvantages for another sector. And we do describe various examples of that. And we do acknowledge, of course, that there are differences in perceptions and values at times around invasive alien species, and particularly when thinking about their contributions to people or their effects on good quality of life. And we do also include aspects around ethics and the important ethical considerations, particularly, for example, with management, as was mentioned there. So I hope that although, yes, many of our graphs are looking at the numbers of records over time, for instance, and are quite sort of data driven in a quite sort of traditional sort of natural sciences way, we do include a lot of information. We had some amazing social scientists and others working alongside us as well. And I think that, you know, going forward, when we're thinking about the impacts, for instance, it is really important that we begin to be able to better document impacts on cultures, for example, and bringing into that the evidence around sort of conflicting values. But then what I will also say is that we do cover, for example, and now my long answer, I think, is you're probably beginning to realize how much I've been immersed in this assessment, so I'll apologize. But I just finished by saying about adaptation that we did include some information around people adapting to invasive alien species, for instance, as well over time. But what I think is quite interesting there is often it was seen that people were adapting through necessity, not because they had a desire to adapt to that particular species.
Okay,
I hope
brilliant.
that does answer your question, but drop me an email if not.
Thank you. Interesting that freshwater frequency of invasion is low compared to terrestrial. Is there any evidence that the impacts in freshwater are more severe on average?
Yes, so I think that in terms of it is interesting that we got those differences. I think that in terms of when we think about some of the catastrophic invasive alien species events that have occurred in freshwater, we really can see how severe those impacts are. And I think, and this sort of links to the next question about islands, I think the scale of an island, in some ways, these freshwater bodies, particularly sort of these closed water systems, lakes and ponds, for instance, can be considered as kind of islands, and you know they are incredibly vulnerable to these changes brought about by invasive alien species and the sort of cascades of effects that happen after there is an arrival of invasive alien species. So yes, so although the numbers, I think it's the same when you look across the regions, and we see that 7% of the invasive alien species were from the records were from Africa. Yeah, the actual kind of magnitude of the impacts of those invasive alien species are huge in these places, and yes, in freshwater.
Thank you. Yeah, and what scale would we consider an island? So would the UK mainland be considered in this context?
Yeah, so I think the UK mainland would be considered to be an island. Similarly, when we thought about New Zealand, I think when within the report, we do talk about remote islands specifically as well. And, I think that looking, and of course with the UK overseas territories, many of which are remote islands, I think it's really important to that we acknowledge the major impact of invasive alien species, and that they are probably the I mean, and I shy away a little from ranking the different drivers of biodiversity loss, because I think, they are all important and they are interacting with one another. And I think it's so context and site specific, and indeed taxonomic specific. But islands are incredibly vulnerable to invasive alien species, and these remote islands and indeed remote places are not protected from the arrival of these invasive alien species is extremely concerning.
Switch over to the Q&A for a second. Is there any national database where we can report species we think may become invasive, or activities that introduce invasive species or break biosecurity measures?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So we have an alert system in the UK for species, including for species that aren't yet here at the moment. And there's a number of species outlined on the Non-Native Species Secretariat website, which is a particular priority to hear about. And I'm sure people have all heard about the Asian hornet incursions in the recent months within the news, but there are of course other species listed on that page as well, for which they are seen to be a priority to hear about. But also on that site there are contact details where you could, if there's something you're particularly concerned about, a particular activity or a particular species, then most definitely you can use the information on that web page, and I'm sure the Non-Native Species Secretariat would be pleased to hear from you as well.
Yep, that is exactly what I would have said.
Good.
What would you say was the most revelatory finding from your work?
Oh gosh, well, I think that, I think going into it, of course, we knew as a team of experts that invasive alien species were a major threat to biodiversity loss, and indeed that had been highlighted from the global assessment. I think, though, that in the global assessment, which I think is an amazing, amazing report, they had ranked the drivers of biodiversity loss by looking at evidence on a global scale. And I think what's really important to note with invasive alien species is that, of course, their impacts may be quite local. And so therefore, in terms of when there's looking at a global analysis and in terms of ranking, they may not come up as high as climate change. But I think it's really important to note, and from the evidence that we've drawn on just these very dramatic and in some cases irreversible effects that invasive alien species can have, and really highlighting that perhaps they've been overlooked as a major driver of biodiversity loss in the past. So I really hope that one of our findings is that we really highlight the importance of the threat of invasive alien species and this context specificity of the different drivers of change, but also the ways in which they're all interacting with one another.
Yeah. How important do you think flagship and umbrella species are in helping combat invasive species?
I think it's a really excellent question. And I think in terms of communication, they can be really helpful in terms of combating invasive alien species, because they can provide tangible examples that help people understand the problem. And I think, that's part of the media interest has been that people can relate to the problem of invasive alien species. They can see them in their own back gardens or when they're out and about. And I think those kind of prominent species are a very good reminder to people of the potential threat of other species. So I think as a communication tool, I think that's really important.
Yeah. And what role does a One Health approach have in how we deal with invasive species?
We do include quite a lot of information on the One Health approach through, particularly, we mentioned it within the first chapter, and also we come back to it within the chapter on management, chapter 5, and the chapter on policy options, chapter 6. And I think it is really important. It's really important that we begin to embrace environmental health alongside human health, animal health, and plant health, which is what the One Health approach is trying to achieve. I think it's possibly fair to say that environmental health has been a little neglected alongside some of those other types of health impacts around human health, for instance. But I think as well, what the One Health is doing is recognizing that the degradation or effects towards environmental health will obviously have effects on human health. So again, it's about these interlinkages, which is what's being recognised in the One Health. So we can't afford to neglect environmental health, even if it really is human health that might be at the core of a particular sector's interest. Then ensuring that they acknowledge the impacts of on environmental health is really important if they're going to get a kind of holistic and suitable solutions going forward. We also mentioned something around one biosecurity as well, and this is just really focusing around the importance of mechanisms that could be employed for one particular kind of health sector that will have benefits to other health sectors as well. And we outline that one biosecurity approach and the importance of thinking across sectors, thinking across borders, thinking across disciplines in coming up with solutions to address the major threats we're facing.
Yeah. A few more. So what are the contribution of fire regimes on alien invasive, especially plants?
Yeah, so I think, it was really dreadful to see those pictures from Hawaii and indeed other regions of the world, and seeing how invasive alien species, particularly, for example, in the case of Hawaii, the grasses are providing fuel for the fire. But also we know that after the fire, after there have been these fires, that sort of disturbance can then create more opportunities for other invasive alien species to arrive and establish, particularly plants, and can then exacerbate the problem in future years. So I think this is where this sort of ecosystem restoration is really important, and ensuring that after there has been an event such as that kind, that the land is managed to really reduce the threat going forward. But I think I think it's going to be sadly a growing problem, because the number of places where these invasive alien plants are occurring that are in some cases really highly flammable, and with increasing and worsening climate change, we're going to unfortunately see increases in those kind of pictures that we saw through the summer. So it is really concerning. But again, I think it shows, just as I mentioned before, thinking about sort of One Health approaches and other approaches of sort of integration, it's important that we recognise these interlinkages and the ways in which, when we have disturbance within land or indeed seascapes, that this can lead to opportunities for invasive alien species, and similarly the interactions with climate change as well. So I think we really need to embrace the interactions amongst invasive alien species and other drivers of biodiversity change to really get a good picture as the kind of scenarios we might be facing in the future.
I'll just shift back to the chat. Oh, actually, I think we've answered all of those. So we've got one more in the Q&A. Are any of the invasive species likely to help us mitigate or adapt to climate change?
Yes, definitely. I think as we see climate warming, we're going to see species that would not have been able to establish and spread in particular regions become able to establish and spread. And I think that's particularly the case, just as an example, with some of the ant species that we're hearing about. And there was a red imported fire ant has now been reported in Italy, and that's a species that, with some climate warming, I'm sure will be able to spread further northwards. And indeed, we're already seeing with Argentine ant, for example, that the conditions in southern England may be becoming more favourable, particularly in cities, for that species. So we know that there is this strong link between some of the invasive alien species and climate change. I'm sure there will be some as well that are unable to cope with the conditions that they see going forward. So it will be a mixed picture. But most definitely, I think that it's important to embed within our predictions these effects of climate change.
Yeah. More of a comment here. So there's been a few saying thank you for a brilliant presentation. All very interesting, even if a stark but important message. I hope there's much future exposure of this in-depth knowledge and reports to a much wider audience. So I hope we can hear an update on the positive impact this research can have on policy and changes in management and control approaches. And I'm sure there will be plenty of that in future.
Yeah, no, thank you for that message and those kind words. as I said, it's really been such an immense privilege to be part of this process and to work with such an incredible team, and now to have such interest in the report. So I'm really delighted to be with you all today. I gave a talk a few days ago to the Finnish government and associated bodies, and I will be in Kenya for the CBD meeting to give several presentations. G7 are also interested, and so there are a number of presentations that we'll have an opportunity, and as an expert team we'll take every possible opportunity that we can to provide updates from the assessment. And I know that also IPBES, who have been incredible to work with, will be collating kind of impacts within their impact databases as well. So maybe in a year or two we can have a summary of what the impacts have been. But I really think the most important thing that we can probably all do at this particular moment is to raise awareness, to highlight that the report is there, to point people in its direction. And when the chapters are published, I really hope that you'll find even more useful information within that, particularly chapter 5 and 6, which have the options available for management and policy.
Yeah. Another question. Do you know of any examples where the polluter pays principle is successfully applied to invasive species?
Oh, that's a really excellent question. Thank you for that question, Paul. So I am trying to think, and I'm sure there are other people on the call who would be better able to answer than me, and certainly that could be put into the put into the chat. I think that in terms of, probably to answer it in a long way around and not answer it, I guess, is some of the work that I've had the pleasure of doing for the European Commission in recent years has been working with stakeholders, and Lucy was involved in the project as well, to co-design and co-create communication materials for different sectors. So, sometimes it's not evident where the invasive alien species or how it has arrived in the place it has arrived, and it's not always clear, but in some cases of course it is clear. And we know that there have been, for example, escapes from confinement, or people releasing pets, often doing it in a sort of very well-intentioned way, thinking that this will be great for their pet's welfare or whatever. But of course, that is a misguided action. And so I think sort of that raising of awareness to prevent those kind of actions, and to ensure that we promote sort of responsible pet ownership, responsible gardening, responsible recreation in water bodies, and following the sort of check, clean, dry, and bee plant wise and excellent campaign materials that Lucy has ensured are on the Non-Native Species Secretariat website is really important. And you can access this Beware of the Aliens campaign. So it's a very round the way of saying that I'm not really sure of evidence of that, but I am sure that these sectors are engaged within the process. And when we look at sort of voluntary codes of practice and things like that, and the uptake of those, I think that that's all very, very encouraging. We just need to do more to promote those, and acknowledging that, of course, prevention is by far the most cost-effective and most effective way to manage invasive alien species. So helping those sectors who might be the kind of people or sectors introducing species of concern know the kind of actions that they can take to be able to reduce the threat that their activities might be posing. So I'm sorry that's quite a round the way answer, Paul. But I think, again, it's all about communication, raising awareness, and ensuring that people have the best tools in place to prevent the arrival of these species in the first place.
Yeah, if anyone does have any good examples they'd like us to share with Paul, you can contact us and we'll pass those on. Just checking if there are any other questions. There's lots of very nice messages for you, Helen.
Yeah, that's very kind. Thank you very much for those lovely words. I will share them with the team as well. We're in very close contact.
Okay, one more. So yeah, thank you for a brilliant talk, Helen. Lots of great terminology to use in our own awareness raising. I was wondering if the report will proactively be sent to the policymakers and governments.
Yes, so just to say, with the process, for example, there are more than 140 governments who are member states of IPBES, and at the IPBES plenary they were represented, and they negotiated the summary for policymakers line by line by line. I think we worked out we had 40 hours of negotiation negotiations around the summary for policymakers, and it was a really fascinating and important process because essentially that's the point at which the government's taking ownership of that report, and so they already have it, and they have already had the opportunity to, if you like, edit it in. It has to be based around the evidence in the chapters, so any edits they made were came from the chapters, but essentially they have ownership of it. So I guess then it's important that we promote it to others as well, and that we support those governments in the ways in which they can be using it. And I have said this at a number of talks as well. I think we're in a really fortunate position in the UK. We have the non-native species secretariat. We have amazing coordination. And we have amazing collaborations across different sectors. And I think we have a real opportunity linking into sort of capacity building for other nations, but also sharing the good practice that has been so thoughtfully developed within Britain with others to ensure that they can maximise their approach to addressing this threat.
Yeah, and we will share everything through our mailing list when it's available, so we'll promote that as well. So I think we've just gone over our time, but we can probably hang on 10 minutes or so if there are any other questions. I've seen people starting to drop off. So I'll give it a couple of minutes and see if there are any others. If you do have any that you think of afterwards, you can contact us and we'll pass them on to Helen. I'll put our email address in the chat box.
Yeah, it's lovely to see people's messages appearing and seeing the names of people who've really had a major role within providing evidence and action on the ground for invasive alien species. So I think that there's just such, as on this call, inspiring people who are doing so much already. So yeah, thank you to you all as well. And I hope I haven't been too muffled with COVID.
No, and thank you very much for joining, even though you're not feeling brilliant.
That's all right. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I can't see any other questions. So I think that's it. Just lots of nice messages for you, Helen. I'll let you have a look at those afterwards. Yeah, so thank you again, Helen, for a brilliant talk and for your time today. I know you've been so busy promoting this, so yeah, we really appreciate you joining us. And thank you everyone for joining. We've recorded the talk, so as soon as it's available, we'll send a link out to everyone, and we'll share more information about the report as we have it. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
And thank you, Lucy, for all your organisation as always. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Nice to see you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.